Today is Monday, March 25th, 2019. We're in Austin, Texas at the University of Texas at Austin campus inside Studio 4E of the CMB. My name is Scarlett Gamies, interviewing Dr. Arturo Madrid for the Voces Oral History Project. Thank you, Mr. Madrid, for allowing us to interview you. We want to remind you that today's interview will be housed at the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection on our campus. Please know that if there are things you don't wish to share, you are not obligated to do so. Also, if there are things you want to share, please let us know. Okay, let's begin. Can you please say your name and how you were involved with what became the South Texas Border Initiative?
My name is Arturo Madrid. I was involved with the South Border Texas Initiative because I was directing an Institute for Policy Studies on Latino issues at the time that initiative was introduced, and some of my colleagues who worked with me at the Tomas Rivera Center, the name of the Institute for Policy Studies, worked with MALDEF and other entities involved in that initiative. Mm-hmm. And this was late 1980s into the early 1990s.
Mm-hmm. You also played a significant role in hosting the community groups involved in planning out the South Texas Border Initiative. How did that come about?
The Tomas Rivera Center that I referred to, an Institute for Policy Studies on Latino Affairs, one of its charges was to put together community groups, people from the various sectors of the community, to discuss challenges and issues facing the community. And when we were approached by MALDEF and the other entities involved in this major lawsuit against the University of Texas and Texas A&M University, we were asked to convene members of the community, leaders in the community, educators, as well as members of the legislature to talk about the matters and to provide advice to MALDEF and its colleagues and its fellow organizations.
Yes. Also, Trinity is a private university. It was not part of the lawsuit that was taking place at the time, nor did it stand to gain from additional resources to public state universities. So why did you decide to get involved?
The Tomas Rivera Center was an independent 301 C3 organization, that is a tax-exempt organization. It operated on the campus at Trinity University, but it was not part of Trinity University. It was an independent institution, and thus Trinity University was not directly involved. They hosted us, but they were not part of the institute.
Okay. Were you able to sit on any of the meetings, and if so, how would you be able to characterize them?
Yes, I participated in a number of them, not all of them. I was not centrally involved in them. I was based in California, and the meetings were taking place in Texas. Whenever there was a meeting and I was in town, I would participate in it. I would characterize them as a very professional set of meetings. Carried on by very good staff, the staff of the Tomas Rivera Center office in Texas at Trinity University. We facilitated those meetings, we recorded them, we provided the information to MALDEF and the other entities.
Okay, do you remember any specific anecdotes from those meetings? Do you recall the points of contention from those meetings?
No, I have to say that since I was not central to the initiative, I certainly was the president of the organization and oversaw, and I sat in on it. But it was a Texas initiative. I was not a Tejano. It was not part of my direct world, and thus I absented myself from the discussion.
Okay. What is a memorable encounter or conversation you had with someone regarding unequal funding or discrimination in higher education?
I had multiple ones, both related to that initiative as well as to the larger environment. I had been involved in higher education issues for almost 3 decades by then. I was very knowledgeable about the inequities that obtained in higher education throughout the United States for Latinos, and particularly about those inequities as they obtained in Texas. I certainly knew that a great many Texans had to leave the state to pursue graduate education, which was what I was centrally involved in, because there were no opportunities for them in Texas. I certainly knew that the options for Latinos with respect to Texas A&M and University of Texas were also very limited. Very small number of students were accepted to either of those campuses, and that they were marginalized at other regional campuses, whether junior colleges, community colleges, or small four-year institutions, and that those were truly absent in the south of Texas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, during this part of the interview, I would like to discuss your book, In the Country of Empty Crosses, and what inspired you to create it.
Yes. I have been involved in higher education issues for many years, but I'm defined by two things: where I come from, New Mexico, and what I've done in my life, over the course of my life. And the reason I mentioned about New Mexico is because my normal experience is to be asked, and where are you from? People hear my name, look at my face, listen to my speech, and conclude that I don't fit the image that they have of who belongs. And so my response is that I am from here. And the follow-up question is essentially, and where are your parents from? And I say, from here. Mm-hmm. And that inevitably leads to the third question, and what about your grandparents? And I say, and my grandparents, and their grandparents, and their grandparents as well. Mm-hmm. I'm from New Mexico, which is part of this world long before the United States came to existence here. And so I wanted to write about being a New Mexican, and how New Mexico shapes my life, my world, my way of thinking. And I wanted to document a very special history, which is also runs contrary to the usual imagining. The usual imagining is anybody that's Mexican or Latino is Catholic. My family was not. They were Protestants, a very unusual history and a very unusual trajectory, and I wanted to map that out and write about it and leave it for future generations to see that we are as varied, as different, as complex as any other American population.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. What were some of the social issues that you noticed during your childhood and adolescent life?
There were two that were very present in my mind always, and they were related. Our absence from the larger world. I would read magazines assiduously, newspapers, read them assiduously, and when television comes along, see television as well. And we were absent from that world. Mm-hmm. And the second that I experienced very early on, and which I observed around me, was discrimination in the form of exclusion or marginalization of Latinos from the institutions of the society, and how we were kept separate from the larger populations in all kinds of ways. I remember when I was writing In the Country of Empty Crosses, one of the people who came to hear one of my stories said, one of the most segregated things in New Mexico is the cemeteries. And it was so. There were Catholic cemeteries for Catholics who were Hispanos and for Catholics that were not. There were Protestant cemeteries for Hispanos and for Protestants that were not, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What were some issues that faced the local Mexican-American community as a whole?
The continuing challenges for Mexican-American community is inclusion in the institutions of society in any full sense of the word. For many years, I talked about the fact that we needed to have participation in the institutions society that superseded our participation in the institutions of imprisonment. So many of our young people, for example, and some older people are in prison, in jails, etc. I said, that's an institution, and we need to be represented we need to be more represented in other institutions, educational institutions, civic institutions, economic institutions, financial, social, and cultural institutions. So we are not present in that world. Our level of education is not very high, in part because there's a history of exclusion from education, but also because our population is a young population. We are absent with respect to our engagement in the critical institutions of society that determine our future. We don't have very many people who are in positions of leadership to be able to set policies that address our concerns. We are still not able to define policy as in the interests of our community. A good many policymakers still talk about the fact that our issues are cultural, our challenges are cultural, our issues are familial, or our challenges are familial and not subject to public policy solution. Well, we argue that they are public policy issues and need to be addressed as public policy issues, that they're not cultural and familial. They're not defined principally by cultural and familial concerns.
Did you personally experience any hardships regarding your identity and the way you were perceived?
I would not characterize them as hardships. I would characterize them as outright discriminatory, bigoted, prejudiced behavior. I recall, just by way of example, children, Anglo children, essentially squeezing me out of activities, not because I didn't speak English, not because I was not a good student, but because they thought those opportunities belonged to them, and what was I doing here? I recall having trouble getting jobs because the perception that I was not as smart, I was not as educated, I didn't speak English as well as my Anglo counterparts. I recall being interviewed for a job as a teacher of English because allegedly I had an accent. The man had not bothered to determine whether I had any preparation. He just, on the basis of hearing me speak English, he decided I wasn't qualified to speak English. Those kinds of things are there, and you remember them profoundly. Beyond that, there are discrimination that occurs that is much more subtle. You can't pin it down, but you know it's very present there. You get eliminated from consideration very easily. And your credentials are just as good, your presentation is just as good, your qualifications are just as good, your range of experience and depth of experience just as good, but somehow you don't qualify.
Going on with that, how did your geographical location affect the type of education that you were receiving growing up?
It did profoundly. I grew up in a very small Hispano community in New Mexico. Hispano is how we refer to ourselves in New Mexico. And my initial study was in a public school run by by nuns. So my first several years of schooling was under religious. That changed with a very famous case that came out in New Mexico, known as the Dixon case, and went all the way to the Supreme Court. Had to do with separation of church and state. Forced the religious out of school, out of public schools, and they created their own private schools. And then I continued to go to school with lay teachers, local teachers for the most part, Hispanos, other Hispanos with occasional Anglo teachers, formed in that community by those teachers. Well, their way of life, their way of thinking, their perspectives, and the like. That launched me then into a larger world where there was nobody, or fewer and fewer people like me, into a larger Anglo world. But by virtue of two things, the fact that my parents were educated persons and moved through a different world. They crossed into the Anglo world, and the larger Anglo world, public school world, was an Anglo world. And by virtue of the fact that I went to a missionary school, a religious school, which was run by Anglos, I had a heads up in that regard. By the time I went to university, I knew how to move in both worlds very smoothly.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of your parents, what were your parents' values and beliefs, and how did that alter your values and belief system?
My parents were very, first of all, religiously formed, very socially aware, very socially conscious, very concerned with doing well, and doing well not only for themselves, but doing good, that is, helping their community, and making sure their children were well educated and had good values. That made a great deal of difference. They were both formed as Protestants, and the social mission, the social consciousness of the Protestant Church was part of their mission.
Mm-hmm. And how was your relationship with your siblings growing up?
I was the eldest of the three. I was at least almost 3 years older than my second sibling. So I was the leader of the gang. And in time, I was more interested in my peers than in my siblings. My two younger siblings became very close. I had a good relationship with them, but not as close as they were. We were speaking, my sister and I, about it recently. Mm-hmm. She and my now deceased brother were very close.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Also, I would now like to ask you about your involvement in organizations and certain groups. What organizations or groups did you join in your early life?
In my early life, my principal organization had to do with the church, with the Presbyterian Church, Presbyterian youth organizations in the church, and we're very much, that was my world. And then when I went off to university, academic organizations, honor societies, and the like. That was my principal activity.
Mm-hmm. And what parts did you like about being in those groups, and what parts did you dislike, or, what parts did you notice that could, need some change?
Well, in both cases, despite the fact that this was New Mexico, when I went there in 1956, would have been probably on the order of 90% Anglo, maybe 10-15% Hispano at best. And so we were fairly marginal to the institution across the board. About the only place that we had a sense of presence was in the Spanish department, the Department of Education. And of course, the service workers were Hispanos. But not a lot of my classmates were Hispanos. I would maybe identify 2 or 3 in a given class. And in certain areas, none. In English, which I was a student of, very few. In history, which I pursued as well, very few. Only in the Spanish department would I find other Hispanos. The same thing, and in the honors societies, of course, the same thing would obtain. I would usually be the only one. Not always, but usually. With respect to the church societies, for the most part, except for the fact that I brought some of my peers, some of my Latino friends, Hispano friends into, I was the sole Anglo in those organizations, and felt it very strongly. It served me well in the long term because I learned how to function in that world. But I was pretty well the one and only. So I've been used to being the one and only for a long time.
Did you have, in your early life, any mentor or guide or a certain individual that, helped you along the way, or you helped build like a close relationship with?
I would say that I had multiple ones. I wouldn't say that I had one. I had a couple of minister friends that were very supportive and very helpful to me, moved me along. I had a couple of teachers that did the same thing. And one of my professors, I had multiple sponsors at the university, which is very different from a mentorship, but sponsors people who move me along and help me along. I probably had a mentor at the university who moved me to then pursue studies in Spanish literature and to get a PhD in that field. But I would say more than mentors, I had sponsors. I had a great many sponsors that helped move me along.
Was there a certain piece of advice that kind of resided with you?
No, I would not say that there was a certain piece of advice. I would say by example, they taught me to knock on doors and to walk through doors and to look for opportunities always, to look out, not to settle for whatever there was, but to try to do better than that, and not to delimit myself in the sense, let me give you the example. I could have stayed for graduate study at the University in Mexico. They said, no, move on. I could have stayed in California after I completed my graduate studies and said, no, move on, go explore the larger world.
Yes, you know, and you serving in many institutions and organizations later out in your career, what was your end goal in being part of all these organizations and groups?
I talked about finding myself at the university and thinking that there were going to be a great many people at the university like me, and then finding out that there weren't. Then I went off to California to graduate school, and I thought surely in California at UCLA there were going to be a great many. And I found that there were even fewer there. And then, of course, I went to my first teaching job in New Hampshire, in Dartmouth, and I was literally the one and only. And I said to myself, my word, I have to start thinking about how to address this absence, our absence from the institutions of society, starting with the institution of education, higher education. And so I began to participate as actively as I could in every organization that I had an interest in and that had an interest in me, and participate and to follow a dictum taught to me by the late Tomas Rivera, after whom the Institute for Policy Studies was named, very distinguished writer and educator. It says, you create some space and let somebody else enter it. You open some space up and let somebody else in, and you ask that person to open a little bit more space. And so that has been my mantra for many, many years, to create some space, open it up for somebody else.
When you left New Mexico, how did you compare Mexican Americans in California to New Mexico or in Texas?
It was a very different world. I didn't come to know Texans until much later, Tejanos that is. The California population was, of course, a recent population compared to the New Mexico population, although Californians have been there for a long time. The original California population had pretty well melded into the larger population, but the newer Mexican population was people who had come to California in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, after the Mexican Revolution, and subsequently to work in the fields of California during and after the war. So it was a much more recent population. They were much more Mexicano. They saw themselves as Mexicanos. They identified as Mexicanos, but they were also beginning to identify as Mexican Americans, which is a wonderful experience because that's why I connected with Mexican Americans and with what began to develop as the Chicano movement.
Was there discrimination by Catholics against Protestants, and if so, in what form?
In New Mexico, very much so. There were tremendous tensions between Hispano-Catholics and Hispano-Protestants. There's a mutual rejection of each other. The discrimination, the tensions that existed with the larger community had to do with as much with race and ethnicity as it had with religion. But between Hispano-Protestants and Hispano-Catholics, it was about religion. There were also profound class difference between the Anglo population and the Hispano populations.
And another difference was, you know, growing up, how was it like speaking between Spanish and English from like home to school, and how did that make you personally feel?
During the period that I was growing up, that is the 1940s into the 1950s, Spanish was prohibited. It was a prohibited language by law, and by fact too. You were discouraged from speaking Spanish. You were supposed to speak English in the public space. They couldn't govern the authorities, whoever they were, formal or informal authorities, could not govern what you did in private, but they surely could inform what happened in the public space. And so in public spaces, particularly for children, you were forbidden to speak English. At school, you were forbidden from speaking Spanish, is what you mean. You had to speak English. It was the language of school. It was language of education. It was language of being a citizen. And so we were expected to do that. At home, you could speak Spanish, and with your peers, you could speak Spanish, and with your elders and with your family, you could speak Spanish. And there was a segment of public life, that is, the public life as it was defined by the legal system and by the shall we say, the public system of laws in governing taxes, governing property. There, the state was mandated to use Spanish. Spanish had to be used, and then people needed to understand what their rights were, what the obligation was. So in the public space, that courthouse, where as the treasurer, the count, and the county clerk, et cetera, business was carried on in Spanish. And my mother was a public official, and so there, Spanish was a legitimate language. And so for me, there was not a problem. I could move between Spanish and English perfectly well. I had no qualms about it, ever. But for my peers, it was a very different situation.
Mm-hmm. And in your previous work, you discussed the slow progress of getting Latino professors. What do you think can be done to remedy the problem?
It's a complicated problem. I came along at a moment where there was not inconsiderable opportunity in higher education. In the 1960s, higher education was expanding at an extraordinary rate. Institutions were being created. Money was being allocated so that students could go to, poor students go to school, and there was an encouragement for that. That began to close down in the 1970s. By the 1980s, it had become very problematical. Students that had completed PhDs could not get a job. There are no positions available. And that's been the situation ever since. It's been a shrinking field. And the replacements then, we've not been able to increase the number of significantly. We've been able to increase the number, but we've not been able to increase the percentage, the proportion significantly of Latinos getting the necessary credentials to become academics. And then the percentage of opportunities available to them, jobs, positions, etc., has shrunk dramatically. I mean, astoundingly. I believe there are fewer than 20% of the professoriate now is tenure track, which is very, very important consideration. 80% are adjuncts these days. And if you're going to really affect institutional higher education, you have to be on that tenure track. You have to be a tenured professor. You have to have standing in the institution. So it's very, very difficult. It's also gotten very expensive to pursue a graduate degree and become a professor. And the chances of doing well have decreased. So there are certain fields where we have managed to do well. Anything having to do with Mexican-American studies, Latino studies, we've done pretty well. In some of the science fields, we've done okay because there's been a push there. And in education, because the burgeoning population of Mexican-Americans and Latinos is so great that they need teachers, they need professors, and so that's helped there. But between opportunity and the finances, it's very difficult.
When did you first start noticing the lack of resources for the Latino community?
This became very apparent in the final decade of the 20th century. During the Reagan administration of the 1980s, public policy determined that higher education was a private good rather than a public good, and that fewer and fewer resources were to go into higher education to support students. This is a moment when the numbers of minorities, people of color, begin to enter higher education. And that's a moment when it begins to become a private good, and you have to begin to finance your education on loans and on work rather than on scholarship. And tuition gets higher and higher because public monies are not being allocated. So institutions begin to charge. And pretty soon, fewer opportunities in graduate education, fewer support, less support for higher education, fewer fellowships to support graduate education, and proportionally. And our numbers are growing. It's a crunch. So it's very apparent by the last decade of the 20th century.
And why do you think it is so important that more Latinos enter the field of education? Do you think they would make a great impact on our community for future generations?
There are two capitals in our world. One is economic capital, and the other one is human capital. And human capital is what you know, what you're able to do, how you're able to develop your abilities. The society has historically been made some compromise between the development of human capital and the development of financial capital. In the 19th century and into the 20th century, we invested a great deal in developing human capital. These days, we're less invested in developing human capital for the specific use of the public good. We're developing human capital for private interests. That is, I will support you to get an advanced degree as long as it benefits my corporation, my company, to make money. Not for the well-being of the society, but for the well-being of my corporation and for my financial well-being. So that's the dilemma we have, that there is not much, there's less and less interest in investing in the public good, in the human capital that has as its interest the public good, and much more interested in the private good and how much money can I make as fast as I can.
And that's unfortunately a very sad reality.
That's our reality.
What would you consider as your greatest achievement in helping the Latino community?
Immodestly, that I've dedicated my life to developing the intellectual resources of the Latino community in some way or another. And the principal activity I've been involved in is the development of a significant cadre of Latino academics across the board. And it was not an individual effort initiative, it was a collective effort initiative, but I was fortunate enough to be placed in a position where I could advance those interests through the directorship of the Ford Foundation's Graduate Fellowship Program for Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, through the creation of an organization called the National Council for the Advent of Chicanos in Higher Education, which went the next step and helped academics get tenure and move into academic positions and into advancement into academic administration. Through work on a variety of initiatives to increase the number of Latinos pursuing higher education, through various organizations and institutions. that has been my life's work. And secondly, supporting organizations, either participating in them or by contributing to them, that sought to advance those goals and interests. A secondary and even tertiary effort by sitting on boards of organizations, on commissions, and advocating for the interests of Latinos in higher education.
What Latino issues concerned you the most when you were beginning?
Our absence from the institutions of society, our low levels of education, our marginalization, culturally, the very deeply the denigration of our culture, of our cultural expression, of our cultural values, of our cultural fund of knowledge and experience.
You've written about documenting the experiences of those who were involved in building Chicano, Latino, Latina studies. What are you doing on that currently, and why did you think it was really important?
I was part of a generation, I was part of a crossover generation, who were prepared in very traditional fields of studies to study our, shall I say, our social and historical experiences, having to do with the past, not with the present. To see ourselves as part of a larger continuum in which we're just a minor microcosm. We challenged that framework. We said our cultural expression, our historical experience, our vivencia, our lived experience, is significant in and for itself. It needs to be valued. It needs to be studied. It needs to be part of what is known about in our lives. And our task then was to disseminate that point of view and all the resources we could gather to bring to bear on it. So mine was a generation that conceptualizes the study of our population and says it's a valid area of study. And by virtue of being a valued study, it's a valued area to be taught and to be advanced. And how do you do that? You develop curriculum. You develop the materials. You invest in carrying out historical studies, research on that. Because nobody's interested and wants to publish them, then you have to develop publishing houses to publish them. You have to develop organizations to disseminate that information. You have to bring together the people that do this work and encourage them and support them and nurture them. You have to develop programs that will help introduce new people to that and develop it. So you have to develop a whole entire infrastructure parallel to the existing ones. You have to create cultural institutions that are going to advance your cultural interests, whether it's art, music, literature, etc., because you're absent from the other one and they're not interested in yours. You have to develop organizations that will advance your political and economic interests, but the larger ones are not interested. You have to develop an entire infrastructure that's parallel to the existing one because they won't let you in that one.
In 1996, you were awarded the Charles Frankel Prize presented by President Bill Clinton in a White House ceremony. Would you say it was one of the most important recognitions in your life?
No, I would not say it was one of the most important recognitions in my life. I would say perhaps it was the most signal recognitions in my life. It was a national recognition, of course, by the President of the United States. People paid attention to it, but I tell the story on myself. that in that room with me, the 5 awardees of the National Medal of the Humanities, the Charles Frankel Award, will Bill Moyers, very famous TV broadcaster, columnist, documentarian, public official. Rita Dove, who was, at that moment was a poet laureate of the United States. And there were 2 other people in that room with me that I remember. And I can't remember the guy's name, except he was the mayor of Missoula, Montana. And I'm sure if he's asked, he said, oh, there was Bill Moyers and Rita Dove, and then there was a guy from New Mexico. Who knows who he was? So, and that's the way it works. That way it works. This other person that got the award. So I would say it was signaled because people paid attention to it and say, but let me give you a little appreciation how it comes not to matter a great deal. I'll give you 2 instances. There's a humanities office in the state of Texas. I would be curious to know how many people in Texas have ever gotten the Medal of the Humanities. Probably not a lot. A few, but not a lot. I was curious to know if they've ever been invited to a meeting of that organization. My suspicion is they have. I never have been. And I've lived here now 25 years. Never any invitation, never sit on one of our boards or committees or participate in our, never come to speak to it, okay? So that gives you some sense, something's amiss over here, right? I bet if I looked in there, I'm probably the only Latino in the state of Texas that has gotten the award. I may be wrong, but I probably am, okay? I'll give you the other one. There were 5 persons in that room that got the award. And I nixed her. Her name is Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's a very prominent intellectual and major author. She got the National Medal of Humanities at the same time I did. She's been invited to Trinity now 3 times. Have I ever been invited to dinner with Doris Kearns Goodwin at Trinity University as part of that? Has I been ever recognized as a Federal Medal of Honor winner? No. No. So it may be significant, but it doesn't translate into very much except your 15 seconds of fame on TV. There are other recognitions that I think may have been more important, okay? And they came not easy, equally hard, but they came. It made it possible for me to do something. I got named at age 35 to be the director of the Ford Foundation's Graduate Fellowship Program for Mexican-Americans and Puerto Ricans. That was significant. It made possible any number of things that I did as a consequence of that. Okay? I had an opportunity to come to Texas and serve as the Murchison Distinguished Professor of the Humanities. I was able to do a great deal in San Antonio, in Texas, at Trinity University as a consequence of that. I was named the president of the Madrid Center for Nation's first Institute for Policy Studies on Latino issues. I was able to do things as a consequence of that. Mm-hmm. I have, I believe, 5 honorary degrees, doctorates. They don't mean very much. They're signal occasions, but not significant. Nobody ever said, oh my, you got a doctorate, an honorary doctorate from such and such an institution? Oh my. No, nobody ever said that. I did get a PhD from UCLA. That's been much more significant in a way.
Yes. To go back on some of the interview questions, what were your ambitions and goals as the founding president of the Tomas Rivera Center?
The real challenge of establishing the nation's first institute for public policy on Latino issues was changing a way of thinking, a conceptualization, which I spoke to you about. The conceptualization was that issues affecting Latinos were issues that were driven by cultural concerns or familial issues, that they were not subject to public policy solution or consideration. And so we had to change that conceptual framework and say, no, these are issues that are public policy issues and can be addressed by public policy. And let me give you some instances of that, okay? As a young man growing up in New Mexico, a boy growing up in New Mexico, I was very much involved in the political world because my mother had been an appointed and elected public official, served in many capacities in Rio Arriba County, northern New Mexico. So I was in a political world. I knew governors, legislators, senators. They came to my house because they were campaigning. They came for votes. My mother was somebody who was well known, and she could help them. So I was familiar with that world. And I knew about voting because I was present at this elections on the council time. And I had an anecdote that I would serve up from time to time, that in New Mexico, 100% of the people that are eligible to vote were registered. And 100% of the people that were registered to vote, 104% registered, voted. Because even the dead voted in New Mexico. So when I go to California and I start hearing about the fact that, well, Latinos, Mexican Americans, it's not their culture to vote. I said, not so. Not so. In my family, everybody in the family voted. At every election. Okay? And then I would talk the anecdote of 100% are registered to vote and 104% vote. Well, so don't give me that crap. That's crap. Or Latinos, Hispanos, Mexican Americans aren't interested in education. I'm sorry, we are. We sacrifice to put our children through school. Every survey I've done shows that Latino parents outperform every other community with respect to wanting their children to have education. Okay. Now, the realities are different. The aspirations are one thing, but the realities are another thing. So we needed to change that conceptual framework and say, no, Latino issues, all of them across the board, are subject to public policy consideration. There may be one or two that are not. Let me give you an example. There's a moment in the 1980s when the usual crazies in American society say everybody has to speak English. English has to be the official language. And people came to me and said, Arturo, we got to do something about it. We got to change it. And I said, this is not going to be changed by public policy. We can fight it, but it's not going to be changed public policy. This has been in the works for a long time. Forced English down our throats, forced to speak English. This is not going to be settled by that. And they said, how is it going to be settled? I said, the corporations are going to settle this because they're going to realize what the population of Latinos increases, they're going to want to sell to them. And how are they going to sell to them? In Spanish. And sure enough, that died a morning. That whole movement died a morning. It wasn't settled public policy, it was settled in private policy. But everywhere else, public policy issues reign. The other thing we needed to change was the way, also a conceptual framework, that we were not part of this society. And so we had to constantly say, we are part of this world. We constitute part of this world. We started using all kinds of statistics to show who we were, that we were a growing population, that would impact educational institutions and health institutions powerfully, that we were going to see supporting the American population through our work because we were going to keep the social security system alive. We had to show through information that we were critical to American society and its institutions, and that we needed to be part of those institutions. And so we had to change the discourse and say, we are you. So at one point or another, somebody says to me, oh, if you had an opportunity to speak to the American people, what would you say? This was on a national television program. I said, if I had that opportunity, I'd say, we are your neighbors. We are your fellow workers. We are members of your church. Okay. And we are your future in-laws. And we are your future. So have some respect for us. So that was the challenge, how to begin to turn that. And now we look back and said, oh, that's interesting. How did it happen? It didn't just happen. People worked at it very, very hard in all kinds of organizations, legal organizations, economic, social organizations, political organizations, to say, we're part of this society. We're part of the framework of society. We're contributors. We're participants. We've been characterized too long as being takers rather than givers. We give too.
So going back to your mother, 'cause you spoke of her, tell me more about your mother. You know, being an elected official, at the time there were very few women in, you know, in elected offices, and her being a woman. And
yeah, not so in New Mexico. New Mexico has a curious history in that regard. I have not explored it as fully as I would like to, but I can tell you that by the turn of the century, there were women present in elected and appointed office in New Mexico. Very, very prominent women who had significant impact on the state and state policies. I think this was very much supported during the Roosevelt administration, the New Deal. There was a great deal of encouragement, support for that. But already, as I say, in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, early part of the 20th century, those people were present. My mother was not the first person, the first woman to have been elected to county office in Rio County or any of those counties. And she certainly wasn't the last. She would have, if my father had been disposed to move to Santa Fe and become part of that world, probably been the Secretary of State, because there were women that had been Secretary of State. And she would have not been the first Hispana to have done so. But there was a glass ceiling as well. They never became governors. They never became legislators. They never became senators and the like. What was very interesting about my family, I suspect, is that there were a number of very strong-willed women on the maternal side, a little less on the paternal side, but on the maternal side, they're very strong-willed women who wanted well by their daughters. I think what helped in my mother's place was she was the eldest, and the son didn't come along until number 4. So there were 20 years in which my grandfather was not going to twiddle his thumbs. He wanted somebody to go out and do something significant. So he was the one, he got her working for the federal government during the Depression, moved her on to become an appointed public official, and then supported her campaign to become a public official. So my grandfather, who was a out-and-out chauvinist, peasant stock, supported my mother, and she became a very present public official. He also supported his second daughter, with whom he had a continual struggle, and she went off to become a nurse. So there was a generation of women that did have support and opportunity. By and large, it was a class function. People who had some class standing were able to do that with their daughters. In my family's case, it was that they were Protestants, and education was very important, and educational opportunity was available, and they were able to move along and become teachers and social workers, and in the case of my mother, a public official.
And going back to earlier in our interview about the South Texas Border Initiative, How often did the community groups meet at Trinity?
I can't say that I know that. That is a question it would be important to ask Dr. Ricardo Romo, who is the director of the Texas office of the Monterrey Center at that point, or one of our colleagues who's very central to that initiative, Jaime Chain, who's the dean of the College of Applied Sciences, Applied Arts at Texas State University. I suspect they have a better sense of how many groups they convened for discussions at that point. But MALDEF and the Tomás Rivera Center did collaborate in that work together.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What do you think the Latino communities can do to keep bettering themselves and keep striving for that equality?
One of the things that we have been very concerned about in recent years, of course, is our absence in the larger policy-making arena, determining what is in the best interest of Latinos. We have elected officials, we have people functioning in the associations, organizations of the society, more non-governmental associations, as well as in the corporate sector. But as I said earlier, one of the driving factors in American society today is the striving for the private good rather than the public good. And that takes two forms, not only doing well financially, but also gaining stature and visibility in the world. And not much by way of interest in the public good, not much by way of support for the public good. And our organizations that are concerned with those issues don't have a lot of support, monetary support, to do that work. The ones that get the money are the ones that are involved in other and not as consequential activity. The second thing is that our young people have grown up ahistorical. They don't have any idea, any real sense, because nobody's taught them about how we got here, why we got here, why we have some presidents at the University of Texas right now, or any other institution in the society. They think we got here on our own, that we worked very hard and got there. They realized we had to break some doors down and really insist on making it possible for us to get here. The resistance has been extraordinary, continues to be extraordinary to our participation larger. There's a great fear factor still involved in that. So it's a task that involves, one, trying to figure out how to develop the consciousness of our community. We don't have a lot of ways of doing it. The likelihood of a young Latino signing up for a class on Mexican American history or Mexican American sociology or Latino sociology, et cetera, is very low. Probably, maybe, if you're lucky, 10% of them do. The rest of them don't. Mm. They're caught up like everybody else in something else, so they have no sense of how they got here or why it's important. Okay, and the second is that the institutions of society are fearful of us, even though they see that we're the future. That is, we are going to hold this country together because we're the only ones that are growing in terms of population, other than Mormons, of course, in Utah and otherwise. Okay, we're growing. Immigrant populations are growing. Unfortunately, we're poor. We don't have a lot of muscle. And it's a very sophisticated and very, very effective system of erasing history. Erase history. People don't understand why things are like that. We're supposed to say this is a great country and forget that people get lynched, that people get jailed, that people get killed, that people get denied jobs, that people get kicked out of the country. forget that. So, oh, that's not me. But it is us. It is us. And somehow we have to figure out how to get young people and their parents and their grandparents talking about these issues and saying, what was your experience? What happened to you? So many of my students, if they take my class, go and interview their parents and their grandparents, say, you were a migrant worker? Yeah. Grandpa was a migrant that came from Mexico and worked here? Yeah. That's how we got here? Yeah. Oh, I didn't know that. That's what happens. And they don't know because it's erased. So we have to figure out how to, not a very easy task, how to get the people that have done well to think, oh, I'm on top of the pyramid. Somebody's at the bottom of the pyramid. I got here because of them, not because I was so smart and so good. Tell them about myself.
What is something you feel is very important to share with someone who might watch this interview?
I would say that the most important thing is that we need to be socially aware and socially conscious and socially engaged. That it's not about just me. It's about us. That's the most important thing we need to learn. And that the benefits of the society are not for the private good, that they're for the public good. And that the well-being of all of us benefits us as individuals.
Is there anything we didn't discuss in this interview that you would like to add?
No, Scarlett, you've been very comprehensive. Thank you very much. You've been very good.
Going back.
Going back.
You didn't ask about how he identifies.
How do you identify yourself as Hispanic?
Identification, as you might have studied a little bit or talked about, is very situational. Okay. Obviously, I'm a male human being, an elderly male human being. That's who I am these days. I'm a grandfather, and I'm a father. I'm a spouse. So those are central to my identification. But you're asking a different question. It says an identification that is very profoundly, very centrally, very problematically American. Who are you? You're not one of us. You're different from us. And my task, my mission has been over the course of my life to say, hey, I'm not just a human being. I'm not just a male, not just a father. I'm also a citizen of this society, a concerned citizen of the society. My origins are important. Not for chauvinistic reasons, but because we are a country composed of people who came here. All of us came here from somewhere. All of us, including the Native American population, came here from somewhere. We're all different. We're part of the human race. You don't get to define who belongs.
Well said.
Okay? Situationally, let's see, what are you? I'm going to size you up and say, what do they want to know? Well, they know that I'm from here, so they're not going to ask me where I'm American or not, although that's always there. I'm say, I'm Hispanic. Why do I answer that? Because I want to dismiss the question as quickly as I can. Because if that person is asking me and they're not knowledgeable about, oh, Hispanic is good enough. Oh yeah, one of those specs. That's it. But if then the second one is, what kind of Hispanic? Then that introduces another level up. Then you say, well, I'm, depending on how I'm feeling, I'm a Chicano. And if the question is, oh, from where? Okay, then I know I'm talking to somebody who knows about it. Okay, so it's very situational. You have to read. If I say Mexican Americans, I say Mexican American from where? I know that they have a little. If I say Chicano and they say, "Oh, tell me about that," then that's an occasion for a different. Or if I say, "I'm an Hispano," what's that? But if they, "Oh, what part of New Mexico are you from?" It's always situational. Okay, so depending on who I'm talking with. Yeah.
Why do you think many Texans have not received the Medal of Humanities?
It has to do with everything that is standard procedure, standard operating procedure, the way of life. Right? Our institutions are governed by people who trace their origins to the founding of the American colonies. They established the organizations, they established the standings, the awards, etc., etc. They name each other to who selects. They seek to clone each other. They seek to identify each other. Some communities have been much better able to penetrate those worlds than others. Some ethnic communities, some religious communities. We have not. I will tell you that I owe my Medal of Honor to the fact that in the Clinton administration there was a man who was Puerto Rican who had a position in the office of the director of the National Endowment of the Humanities. And another friend called him up who knew him and said, "Juan, you have to raise the issue of why there are no National Endowment of Humanities Latino Medal of Honors." And so the director said, "Oh, I didn't know that," because it never occurred to him. He's from New England. He's a Brahmin. Who are these people? Why should I? Okay. I said, "Well, give me some names." That's how my name showed up. That's why I got it. Because somebody pushed it up. I told you, 5 honorary degrees. Only one came because the president knew who I was. Little college, trying to create itself, said, "Oh, we know Arturo, let's give him an honorary doctorate." The other ones, it was because somebody at the bottom of the heap kicked and said, "How come you haven't given a Latino an honorary doctorate?" I said, "We haven't? Oh, do you have any candidates?" Okay, so remember that.
You say most Latino parents want their kids to have an education. How did your parents push you to get a degree?
Oh, never any question I was going to go to college. Never any question but that I was going to do well. They knew that that's what one had to do. So, never any question. I was going to do well in school, and by God, I better do well in school. I was going to do well in college, but I better. So I did.
That's really good. How do you think receiving a PhD from UCLA affected the way people viewed you?
Oh, very interesting, because when I got a PhD at UCLA, we used to say about UCLA what they used to say about car rental companies back then. There was 2 major car companies that rent cars, Avis and Hertz. And Avis had a slogan. So we're number 2. So we work harder at it. Okay. Well, UCLA in 1960 was not a first-tier institution of higher education like Harvard or Berkeley, etc. So one didn't say, "I got my degree at California," because people say, "Oh, Berkeley," and think of UCLA. These days, it is. So UCLA was not a big deal. Okay, it was a good place, but not the big deal that it's become subsequently. Okay. My first job was at Dartmouth College. When I went to Dartmouth College hired from Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, Princeton, Cornell, the University of Pennsylvania, maybe Michigan, and from California. That's the first person that I ever had from UCLA. But I got there. And then Dartmouth College became my important card. Oh, you taught at Dartmouth College? Wow. UCLA didn't matter anymore.
And how did Dartmouth alter the course of your life?
Oh, well, you have another hour or so for a conversation? First of all, socialization. You enter into a Brahmin world. That is a world of people who think they're better than the rest of you, think they have class standing, and even people who don't have it pretend that they do. So the intellectual level of discourse is very high. You learn certain manners, you know, how things operate, you learn how to operate. It was also a very critical moment. I came across people from very different worlds than I had been used to at New Mexico or UCLA. They were from international and national. Second thing, I go to Dartmouth in the middle of the civil rights movement, and when it's beginning to impact higher education. So Dartmouth College, feeling some responsibility because it had been started as an Indian school, so it starts recruiting American Indians to go study there. They also, because of the civil rights movement, start recruiting black students to go there. So that fulgur begins to occur. It begins to attract very good and distinguished faculty from other parts of the world who come with other interests, then recreating sons of the sons of the sons of Dartmouth. Then, so I'm interested in educating them in other ways. So Dartmouth College also becomes a place where there's considerable political activity because New Hampshire is one of the first states to have a presidential election. This was right in the middle of the Vietnam War, and we organized against the then president. And Dartmouth College is a very important place to recruit people, and we organized against the war as well. And we begin to have teach-ins against the war, so I'm right in the middle of that. About that time, American Indian students say, hey, what is this Dartmouth Indian thing? Because that was the mascot, that was the name of the team. We don't want that. And they look around, who's going to help us? There's only one Mexican around who looks like us. So guess who they come to? Would you be our advisor? So I became the quiet advisor behind the American Indian students and getting rid of the American Indian mascot and the name of the team.
Wow.
Little things of history. Do I take credit for that? No. But they needed somebody to help them to come back from their meetings and say, what do you think of that, Professor Madrid? Should we do this? Should we do that? What do we need to do next?
And was it a smooth process, or did y'all have some challenges?
It's still, the Indians still shows up at the games. The team is no longer the Indian, but the Indians still show up at the game, and they still do the wahoo-wah, stuff like that, yeah. It doesn't go away. Just like the Washington Redskins don't go away.
Yes.
Okay? And fourth, there was a struggle also to bring women, because it was an all-male institution. So I was there at a very, very critical time, and it certainly shaped me in profound ways.
What makes you confident that Latino people are the future?
Oh, it's not confidence. It's demography to a certain amount, to a certain sense. It's destiny. That is, our numbers are say it all.
Growing, yeah.
Say it all. We are going to be the dominant population of the United States in the next 50 years. That is dominant in terms of numbers, percentage. What does that mean? Well, it's a very complicated matter because even though they're Latinos in name, in classification, and I remind my students that you're a Latino not only because you identify as a Latino, but because somebody else identifies you as a Latino, not simply because you identify as Latino. that 50% doesn't necessarily translate into anything, except the following. If trends continue as they are, we will be the largest part of the prison population. We certainly are going to be the largest part of the educational population. We're certainly going to be also the largest part of the working population. And we're also going to be in the hospitals and in the rest homes of the society, both as workers and as patients. That's the future. That's the future. Will we be in charge of any of the institutions? Financial, social, governmental? That's the challenge.
Can you give us some examples of what you mean when you say that Latino people have to break some doors down to get to where they are today?
Yeah. Once upon a time, not so long ago, the doors were very clear. They were very concrete. There was de jure, by which law. You couldn't do things by law. You were excluded because of some kind of policy that existed. We don't let you in. Quite apart from de facto, where we just don't play. Like in San Antonio, for years and years, the department stores didn't employ Latinas to work in the department stores. Not because they had any rule or law against it. We just don't. Okay. So there's two types. Where we don't, because that's not our policy to employ, or our policy to have Latino students in this institution, or we just don't do it, okay? So we had to break down the doors, the de jure doors that said it is our policy not to accept you. Say, we're going to make it a policy that you do accept us, okay? And we're going to change your practices as well. So we had to knock those doors down, get rid of policies and practices. Okay? There was a moment when you couldn't buy a house in Austin if you were Mexican or Jew or black. Okay, that's de jure. That's by law. You have to break that down there. Say no, this is illegal. Okay. You can't exclude me from voting because I don't speak Spanish. I speak English. You can't exclude me from education because I'm undocumented. Those are the things we have to break down.
Why do you think there's this perception that Latino people don't care about voting?
Oh, it was in the interests. It was in the interests of the people that were in charge to do that. It was also a way of explaining lack of effort to change it. That was a principally California issue, and it had to do with the reality was that most of them were not citizen or too young. But this was a way of easily saying, we're not going to work very hard at making them citizens, and we're not going to make them very hard at making them voters. We like it the way it is. Politicians don't want anything that moves the waves. What's the word? What's the picture I'm looking at? Creates waves. Okay. They want the voters. They want to know who their voters are and get all 60 of them out and go vote. And they want to create 150 because they don't know what the 150 are going to do. So that's part of it. Okay. So that became a general kind of they're not interested in education. There's a big one that goes back, which permeates academia and social science literature. Studies done in New Mexico by a couple of anthropologists that then, from that small communities, they extrapolate that we are present-day minded, we don't look to the future, that we're fatalistic, that we're more spiritually minded, not concerned with materialism, etc., etc. So all kinds of those things become, from little studies, become great conceptualizations that are imposed on us. So we had to fight against that as well.
Was being a Protestant and Latino unique growing up for you?
What made it different, we were we were set apart from the community in two ways. My parents were professionals. The rest of the population were basically farmers and ranchers and employees, with the exception of people who owned small businesses or worked in the post office and the federal and state offices, right? So and they were educated. My parents were educated people. They spoke English quite well. Okay, so that set them apart. The other one is that we weren't part of the Catholic world. We're different from that. We were set apart from it. The Protestant world had two things. One, it is the creation of a sense of self that separates you out from the rest of the world. Makes you different. Makes you not only see yourself differently, but act differently. You have to not be seen ordinarily, the more morally in all kinds of ways. And most importantly for me, educational opportunity. It promoted education and provided educational opportunity. So in my case, that was not significant, but in the case of a lot of young people, they got an education, a high school education, they got a college education as a consequence of Protestantism. The average Catholic didn't have that opportunity, unless they had the means, unless they had class advantage.
So you would say your church helped you, like, build your persona.
The church helped you build a persona and provided you educational opportunity. That schools that you could go to where there was no school. And then they made college available to you. I went to college by living at that Protestant boarding school by 4 years. That's how I paid my board and room. It made all the difference in the world.
What are some ways that the South Texas Border Initiative can be better memorialized?
Well, it surely should have been memorialized and hasn't, and we lost the opportunity this last term. Extraordinary number of South Texans, the young people, and growing, particularly in the Valley, in San Antonio and South. And there's still, except the University of Texas San Antonio and the Rio Grande Valley, there are no major institutions of higher education. University of Texas hasn't grown to incorporate all those people, nor has Texas A&M. The only institutions that have grown is the University of Houston and Dallas and Arlington. Okay, those are the only ones. And I bet you Dallas and Arlington aren't serving Mexican Americans and not South Texans or Latinos. And UTSA, that was supposed to be serving, and particularly in graduate education, the majority of students at UTSA, graduate students, are not Latinos. In fact, I bet you half of them are foreign students. Okay? And I would say that probably half of the students at UTSA are from South Texas, Latino students, yeah. But proportionally, St. Mary's has more. Our Lady of the Lake has more. Incarnate Word has more. St. Edward's has more. Proportionally. Okay? Not Trinity, but the other ones do. Okay? And we don't see University of Texas in the Rio Grande Valley coming up in the world. We don't hear very much about it. So that needs to be addressed again and say, hey, the students are there. Where are the opportunities for them? What are possibilities for them? Where's the investments there? Everything's happening here. Why is it not happening over there? And you can't even blame Latinos because Latinos are not in charge of those institutions.
How can it be ensured that there are, more graduate programs in fields other than Latino studies?
That's been a continuing complication. It can't be assured. The only thing I can say is that Latinos need to keep pushing and fighting for that, and carrying out a program of educating, raising the consciousness of our population and our leadership that that's what we need. Mm-hmm. I don't see my legislatures at any cultural events, for example, involving our organizations. That's not something that they're interested in. I didn't see any Latinos being given a special award for at the University of Texas. I saw this pendejito, George Brown Bush, being given an award for what? For being brown? I don't see that happening. And I don't see it happening unless we raise the consciousness in our communities. Hey, what's going on here? Why are we not being recognized? Why are not people being recognized? Why, for example, is somebody from New Mexico whose minimal experience in higher education is being the president of some stupid little technical institution in South Dakota now named the president of UTEP after such a distinguished president, 30-year president? I have to say, what's going on here? Why is there not a single Latino president in a single institution, higher education in Texas, or a vice president for that matter? What's going on here? What's wrong with this picture?
Mm-hmm. Going back to being the only Hispano in certain spaces, organizations, do you remember any specific interactions that made you feel singled out?
Oh, that happens all the time, right? All the time. I mean, I suppose if I sat here 15, 20 minutes, I would come up with multiple, but it becomes such a normal kind of situation, okay? I guess I will tell you about an embarrassing situation that I had in a private situation, which was a semi-public situation. And it was even not remotely related to here, but I was having a conversation, and one of the people asked, "Oh, what can you tell me about the chancellor of the such and such community college?" And the fellow who was being asked the question turned and says, "Oh," he says, "we can't talk about that in front of Arturo here." Because I came from that world. And we're talking about a minority person. And it was the only other minority person there. So, but that was a flagrant one. Usually it was much more subtle than that. Mm-hmm. But I have spent a good part of my life being a one and only or a first. Now, all kinds of other people now are finding themselves one and only and first, but it's in a smaller and smaller arena. When I came along, it was a very large one. First Latino professor at Dartmouth College, first Latino dean at the University of Minnesota, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
What advice do you have for current generations working in advancing the educational spectrum on behalf of Latino issues?
Okay, that goes to a larger issue, Scarlett, and that's about leadership. As you know, these days leadership is the big thing, leadership institutes, leadership groups, leadership programs, etc. My thought on leadership is that leadership, by and large, not completely, is conceptualized simply as getting elected to some office and getting some honor or something. That's how it's conceptualized, and that's pretty worthless. If you want to have some impact on anything, you have to identify a need and address it. So look around. What need exists at where stage that you are, and address that need. Okay? Okay? Let me give you an instance. Very simple instance. I bet you that 40% of the women that are studying at the University of Texas right now need child care. They miss their classes or can't come to class because of child care. There's a need. You can have an impact by figuring out, okay, how do we organize? How do we get a space where women can drop off their kids while they go to class? Just an example, okay? That's not an original one, but let me throw that out, okay?
Yes. How did conditions and opportunities for education get to how it is today for Latinos?
Well, right now we're caught up in a very difficult moment in education in general, higher education. I think we're particularly seeing it in the elementary, high school area, where we're now developing a whole set of opportunities, of possibilities for education. And it reflects a changed world, right? And it's not the first time that this has happened. This has happened in previous moments. There's still a big problem in educational delivery that we haven't addressed and may never address, which is we're still on an agricultural cycle of 9 months in school and three months away. We probably, if we're going to really make a difference, we're going to have a year-round schools, quite apart from charter schools, specialized schools, etc. There were 3 major changes or 4 major changes that occurred in higher education over the last century and a half. One was first the creation of what we now know as the Texas A&M type of institution, which is a public institution that is not for the study of theology, history, philosophy, etc., but for practical issues. Okay, state financed. Okay, that was one. So it opened up the world to males principally, but a different kind of male, not the sons of the sons of the sons of preachers and financiers, etc., but the farmers and businessmen, etc. Very practical education. The second one occurred principally after World War II, when education opened up to people that had not had opportunity before. There were no longer the sons of ranchers, etc. There were farmhands, workers, and people. They got to go to school on the GI Bill. Tremendous resistance to that, but it happened, okay? Opened up the world. Federal money made that possible. Just like in the 19th century, federal money made that possible. Creation of state universities and institutions. Then the next one was the Civil Rights Movement, which opened up education to a different population. The not historical population, blacks, browns, Asians, etc., poor and disabled people across the board, immigrants and the like. And money came along with that too. Made all the difference in the world. Created new campuses, new colleges, new organizations. It's all over the country. Okay.
Yes.
Then the conservative movement came along, and they said, education is a private good, not a public good, and we're not going to underwrite it with public funds. That was the crunch. So these days, higher education is for the private good in 2 senses: to educate people who are able to pay for it and will profit the private interests, and it's for what we now know as an expanded military-industrial complex that is everywhere, that says we don't want our tax money being used for anything except what profits us. to build Boeing airplanes, to get tax breaks for whatever buildings we want, to build our factories, to build a playground, a campus for Apple, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we are now.
Is there anything we didn't discuss that you
I
would
don't
like
think
to add?
there's anything we didn't discuss, Scarlett.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking part in this interview.
Thank you. You're a good interviewer, Scarlett. Well done.
Thank you.
And good luck to you.
Great. Yay. Wonderful.